morning, everyone. Welcome to the First Congregational Church of Langsburg's online service. Thank you for joining us here in this digital space. My name is Lily, and this is my mom, Laura. We will be your hosts for today.
Today is the fourth Sunday of Epiphany, the season of celebration of how God's light has come and shone in the darkness in the person of Jesus, revealing God's perfect, limitless love for all creation.
As we explore, we have a few poems, prayers, and readings for us along the way. Blessings on the journey.
Today's poem is Psalm 71, retold by Malcolm Guite, and it contains a reference to a Nigerian city, Ibadan, which is a personal reference to the life of the author who was born there. To help us understand its context, Malcolm writes about this in his blog, saying, "In my response to this psalm, I looked back through all the long years of my life, back to the beginning when I was born in Nigeria 63 years ago. It was touch and go, and it was a Yoruba nurse who saw my mother's distress and ran to fetch the doctor, who was just leaving the compound of the university hospital, and brought him back to make the intervention that saved my mother's life and mine, and continued to nurse us both until we were safe. And now for today's call to worship. You raise us with you in your resurrection. If we will only let you, so Lord, come deliver me and raise me from dejection. Then lift me to your stronghold. Let your name be my delight and my protection. Call me once again and kindle love to flame. For you have been my only hope in all my days of life. You are the Savior who drew me from my mother's womb, when all around me gave me up for dead. But you inspired the nurse who nursed me back to life, back in Ibadan all those years ago. And now I'm aged, I hope a new leaf in my life's manuscript, and write for you another psalm to praise your light and life." Psalm 71, retold by Malcolm Guite.
We light this candle to remind us that Christ is the light of the world, who was born as a human being to dispel the darkness of our hearts and minds. We light this candle to remind us that Christ is God's love revealed perfectly, knowing no boundaries or limits, and calling us to the beloved of God.
Well, good morning all, and welcome to the fourth Sunday in Epiphany. This is the season dedicated to exploring the revelation to the whole world that Jesus is the Son of God and what that might mean for us today. Now, we do this every year because, frankly, we need to revisit this topic regularly. This year is new, and with it comes new challenges which need new approaches. This year, you are new, and we have all fallen asleep in certain ways that need arousal, and we have also woken up in certain ways that need tending to and integration into our life this year. So we revisit Epiphany each year out of necessity. But before we begin, I have a question. Have you ever made someone mad? Now the answer here is 100% yes. All of the people watching here today, you've made somebody mad. Everyone who has ever lived has made someone mad at them at some time. But have you ever made someone so mad that they didn't like you anymore? Maybe they unfriended you on social media, or ghosted you in person. I'm sure the percentage is going to stay high on the amounts of people who have done this, but let's take it further. Have you ever made someone so mad that they wished you harm? Now, hopefully the percentage here drops considerably, but let's take another step. Have you ever made someone so mad that they attempted to cause you harm? I hope that the hands are like dropping all around, like nobody has ever tried to harm me because I made them mad. But we need to ask one more question. Have you ever made someone so mad that they drug you to a cliff and attempted to throw you off? Now, probably not. But that's actually what happens today in the text out of Luke 4. Now, in this cycle of Epiphany, we've been exploring the Gospel of Luke, and this week is the continuation of a story started last week that covers Jesus' first sermon. We looked at the first part last week, but revisit this week and look into the controversy and reaction that follows. So Jesus does his 2-second sermon, his reading on Isaiah 61, messianic promises for all the people, declaring them arriving now in him. And this just totally amazes the people, but they attempt to cash in on it, on Jesus' fame and his blessing, and then turn it against those they perceive as their enemies, which Jesus refuses to do for them. And on top of it, he references 2 stories from their history book of the kings and tips the scales from offended on over to outrage. The people drag him to a cliff and attempt to toss him over, but miraculously, Jesus walks away unhurt. Spoiler, sorry about that. Now remember that this is his hometown. Jesus is not some stranger who just kind of blew into town with a controversial message. He's known deeply like family in this small town made of maybe like 5 large families who lived in community with one another for generations. So what could be said to a close relative or family friend that would spark a mob with murderous intentions? What did Jesus say that filled these people with such fiery passion that led them to want to kill him right then and there? Like no plotting, no scheming, no delay, just this man needs to die and die right now. Well, let's hear this passage read to us, and you'll notice that we got some work to do on the other side because there's nothing on the surface that seems very offensive. So we're going to have to look at the context of the people and of these 2 stories that he mentioned specifically to see what is being said between the lines. So we'll see you in a minute.
Hi, it's Peyton, and I'm going to be doing the reading for today, and it is Luke 4, verses 21 through 30. He began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. "Isn't this Joseph's son?" they asked. Jesus said to them, "Surely you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself,' and you will tell me, 'Do here in your hometown what we have heard that you did in Capernaum.' Truly I tell you," he continued, "no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath, in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elijah the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian." All of the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, drove him out of the town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built, in order to throw him off the cliff. But he walked right away through the crowd and went on his way.
All right, once upon a time, the good guys of the story had a really bad king named Ahab. He was in fact the worst king they ever had. The story actually mentions that specifically, that he was the worst king they ever had. And he married a Phoenician woman named Jezebel. And the 2 teamed up to accomplish some of the worst evils of the story up to this point. They defiled the worship places of their god. It was called the temple. But who can oppose the king and queen when they have all the power? Well, a prophet named Elijah. He took up the task. He walked right into the palace up to the king and said, "Because you're doing it all wrong, I'm not going to permit it to rain for the next few years." Now, agriculturally and economically, this was a power play because the king would then have to open up all the grain storehouses to feed all the poor. It's kind of like liquidating his 401k that he's been saving up for years. But the rivers ran dry for Elijah too, and he needed water and food. So he was told by God to go to a poor widow's house on the fringes of society in a town called Zarephath. She was going to take care of him. And being a widow in a patriarchal society meant poverty. Her only hope was that her son, when old enough to work, could care for her and lift her out of poverty. He was her retirement plan, her hope, her future. But famines hit those in poverty the worst, and she is not different. Now, this widow had just opened up her jar of supplies and found enough ingredients to make a single biscuit for her and her son to share, and then die of starvation together on the other side. Sounds like a wonderful plan. And it was all because some prophet declared no rain. Well, along comes said prophet, Elijah, and he asked for some food and drink. Now, she lets him know the situation in her pantry. And his reply was, "Okay, go cook the meal as planned, but take a crumb for me, for the prophet here, deliver it to me." So she did it. I mean, if you're going to die, what's a crumb to spare, right? So the next day she had enough supplies to eat again. And the next day it happened again and again. It was as if manna from heaven was falling again, just like in the days of Moses, but only on this widow from Zarephath. God's favor has fallen upon this poor woman, and she has faith enough to participate in it by feeding this extra mouth, even though they were going to die. Now, the story does not end here. Tragedy strikes, and her son dies. In the midst of this miracle, in the midst of the provision, all her hope and future is erased with one sickness. Another vulnerability of those in poverty. Now she turns to Elijah and kind of sarcastically asks, well, miracle man, got anything you can do about this? Now Elijah keeps his cool and he takes her son into an upstairs room. And then he freaks out and he prays to God, God, what are you doing? I'm staying in this widow's house. I'm eating her food. And then all this happens? Really? And he goes to the mat with God. And after he does that, he prays over the boy 3 times. And the boy lives again. He composes himself, walks downstairs carrying her son, and gives him back to her, all cool and calm, saying, see, he's okay. And the widow says, now I know you are truly sent from God. So that's a story out of 1 Kings 17, which is a book dedicated to following the monarchy of Israel, 700 to 500 years before Christ appears on the scene. Now this is the story mentioned by Jesus first, and he pairs it with another story further along in the book of the Kings from 2 Kings 5. And this time the prophet is not Elijah, but the one who followed him, Elisha. And instead of a poor widow, we have a very rich and powerful general. Let's take a peek at this story next. Okay, once upon a time, again, there was a political rivalry between 2 great nations, Israel and Syria. They both were laying a claim to a section of land that would tip the scales of power towards one or the other. Hatred abounded between these 2 countries, and the world of lesser nations looked on, wondering who would come out on top. They were not actively at war, but the tension was very fragile between the 2. Now, a powerful general of the Syrian army named Naaman had riches beyond description. He had the favor of a high position politically, and he had all the power he could dream of. He was getting used to having his own way, through purchasing power, favor in high places, or military might. He was in want of nothing, but he had a secret. And that secret was about to be found out that would strip him of everything and send him exiled out into poverty. He was sick. He had a highly contagious disease called leprosy. And this disease did not care about his strength, it did not care about his wealth or his position. It did not care even what happened to his family afterwards. And the whole family is stricken with grief and anxiety about their future. And as they sit there in that moment, something happens. Naaman's family was given a young Israelite girl as a slave to be an attendant for his wife. She had been taken prisoner in a skirmish between the 2 countries, and she remains unnamed in this story, but becomes the hero with one phrase at this one point as they sit in their grief. She says, I wish my master could meet the prophet who lives in Samaria. He could heal him of leprosy. Now this stuck with the general so much that he brought this idea to his king and asked for permission to go behind enemy lines to meet this prophet. And miraculously, the king grants the request. Naaman took silver, gold, and fancy clothes because this is how you barter with enemies. Along with money, he has sent a letter of reference from his king, and it simply stated, I send my servant Naaman to you, heal his leprosy. Now he doesn't go to the prophet, instead he goes to the king, probably assuming that the prophet is for hire from this big boss, right? Because that's how things work. Now the king of Israel tore his clothes thinking the message was for him, saying, I can't heal leprosy. Then he was overcome with anxiety that this was some kind of a trick to start a war with the tensions being so high between the 2 countries. But somehow the prophet hears of this interaction and sends an invitation to the general to come see him. And he does. Now, when he shows up, the story makes mention of all of the entourage of horses and chariots and soldiers who were at the door of Elijah. who actually does not come out. Instead, they receive a note from a little messenger boy, which violates all of the royal manners and customs. And this note simply said, "Go wash in the Jordan River 7 times." Now, this was like a common folk remedy of the day, kind of like take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning. It's like, really? Could have stayed at home, you know? Naaman was utterly offended. 1, that Elijah didn't even bother to come out, and 2, he was given this folk remedy that he could have done at home in better rivers than the Jordan River here. So he turns to go home, totally discouraged, totally mad, but his servants convince him, "Come on, just try it, or else we wasted the whole trip." So Naaman did. He washed 7 times in the Jordan, and it worked. And he wants to shower the prophet with gifts, because that's what you do to settle the score and not remain in debt to anyone and retain your strength and your authority. But Elisha just says, "No thanks." So the general offers a different gift. He says, "When I go back home to my old life, I'm going to have to worship in my old temples. But when I do, know that it is your God whom I worship there." And Elisha accepts the gift. Now, these are the 2 stories that Jesus references and ticks off the entire town. Why? Okay, geography matters. These 2 stories that Jesus references name geographical places. If we are tourists to this text, then we won't know why that matters. But it is the key to understanding why the friends and family of Jesus freak out on him and take him to a cliff to toss him over. The story of the widow is like something out of a Hallmark movie when we read it. We find it inspirational that a widow shows strong faith and is cared for by God. But if we take note of the detail, the widow of Zarephath, we can note that this woman is not ethnically Hebrew. She is Phoenician. And who else is Phoenician in this story's wider narrative? The evil King Ahab's wife, Jezebel. So built into the story from the get-go is a warning not to judge people based on ethnicity or nationality. The next story is a bit more obvious in its use of geography by making note that the general Naaman is Syrian, but also brings in his religious tradition and practices as well. Now, these 2 stories show how God has blessed those considered outsiders. Elijah and Elisha were considered heroes for their confident displays of God's power and judgment. There's this story of the prophets of Baal versus Elijah, where Elijah, in this grand showdown for all to see, called down fire upon his offering, while the prophets of the god Baal were just utterly unsuccessful, and eventually they get slaughtered with the sword. And then that's the kind of story that we idolize into the ideal. This is what it means to be on the right side. We get the power, we get the authority, we get the win. But we have to realize that the widow of Zarephath has the subtle reminder not to gloat in pride about being right or good or blessed, because God's mercy is extended infinitely in all directions. Now, we need to remember that Luke has a sequel called the Book of Acts, which follows the expansion of God's new people after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus. So it makes sense that Luke is taking us on a journey that has its destination there. There's a climactic moment in that book that this passage today is trying to get us to. Now, Peter, who has grown up in his Hebrew religion, has a dream about bacon. Maybe you have a dream about bacon too. His was different because in Acts 10, he sees this sheet of white descending with all these animals that his religion has not allowed him to partake of. Now, he's utterly grossed out, much like my younger self watching a tribesman on the Discovery Channel eat a grub from under a log. Now, the voice of God commands him, kill and eat, which Peter totally objects, saying, I'd never do that. And God says, do not call unclean what I have called clean. Now, this was not merely about the lifting of dietary restrictions from his religious life, but also illustrative of the inclusion of those not ethnically Hebrew into the religion. This went against thousands of years of tradition and was quite radical in its day, and yet still had its roots in the Old Testament in the stories we saw today. And Jesus starts this conversation in his first sermon here and almost gets killed for doing it. He essentially said the Isaiah 61 messianic promises is being extended to all. Now remember, he left out the day of vengeance of our God. Now, this journey of our becoming that we're all on is not about arriving and getting and possessing and then gloating and boasting and wielding it as a weapon. The journey of becoming is a humbling task with mystery and ambiguity and plenty of ups and downs. It's like venturing out into the ocean. The farther you go, the deeper it gets. So the more progress you make outward reveals the depths that there is to actually explore and the depths that you'll never get to. So as you journey into the mercy of God, remain open, honest, and humble, and know that every single soul you encounter on this journey is on pilgrimage too, to wake up to the mercy of God. There's no such thing as an enemy any longer, if they are human. And this will confuse those who don't understand it, who are so used to drawing lines in the sand of good and bad and my side and against. It might even spark an angry mob against you. But notice that Jesus does not lift a hand of retaliation against them, but instead passes right through them, unharmed. May we also know our calling, know our path, and know our God as well as this, and just pass through the mobs around us.
I have a benediction where the map begins. This is not any map, Forget longitude, forget latitude. Do not think of distances or of plotting the most direct route. Astrolabe, sextant, compass. These will not help you here. This is the map that begins with a star. This is the chart that starts with fire, with blazing, with an ancient light that has outlasted generations, empires, cultures, wars. Look starward once, and then look away. Close your eyes and see how the map begins to blossom behind your lids. How it constellates, its lines stretching out from where you stand. You cannot see it all, cannot divine the way it will turn and spiral, cannot perceive how the road you walk will lead you finally inside, through the labyrinth of your own heart and belly and lungs. But step out and you will know what the wise who traveled this path before you knew. The treasure in this map is buried not at journey's end, but at its beginning. By Jan Richardson. Have a great day.
Thank you so much for joining us online today. We hope this service has been a blessing to you. What now?
1. Participate. If you would like to participate in our services, we would welcome your readings with a simple phone recording. 2. Partner. If you would like to give financially to ensure the continuation of this online service, there is a link at the bottom of your screen. And 3. Subscribe. You may subscribe on YouTube or like our page on Facebook to stay updated with our online services.
We hope you found some hope, help, and healing today. See you next week.
Alright, looks like we got stuff going on here. Check 1, 2, 3, 4. It's snowing. That's cool. Gotta run in place, keep the blood moving. Musical.